The question is the bill be read a second time. The honourable member for Indi.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I rise, as I have on several other occasions, to oppose this bill and similar measures that in effect are compulsory student unionism by stealth. And it would be remiss of me not to make some remarks about the comments that have just passed into Hansard from the member for Melbourne. And all I can say, as a summary, Mr Deputy Speaker, is once a trot, always a trot. You can put a suit on, you can put a nice trendy silk tie, once a trot, always a trot. And I see my colleague there, the member for Melbourne Ports, smiling away because he knows that's the truth. They tried to do him over in the seat of Melbourne Ports, and he's very fortunate with the recent redistribution that he's kept all his good people, some would call them stacks, but he's kept all his good supporters and kept out all the trots out of Melbourne Ports. So there is another seat that the Greens won't be able to make headway in, so I'm sure we'll see the member for Melbourne Ports challenge at the next election and probably be returned unless there's a very good Liberal candidate who will give him a run for his money. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, we heard the member for Melbourne talk about very Orwellian language, which is no surprise coming from a trot, very Orwellian language talking about the democratic culture at university. We would all like to think that there was a democratic culture at university. There was an opportunity for people to speak freely about their political beliefs. But you talk to any student in a politics class, in a politics tutorial, and you see how they are intimidated and not given the opportunity to debate political philosophy freely, to debate ideas freely. It's not, as you say, member for Melbourne, an environment of free inquiry and debate, and that does extend to the student political world, which has benefited over many decades through the compulsory acquirement of student funds to fund political activities and campaigns and salaries that they would not choose to fund themselves if students did have a choice. The member for Melbourne talks about the fact that students should be able to, quote, control and direct their activities. Well, I wouldn't disagree with that. That's why we on this side of the House want students, who by and large are adults, to be able to control and direct not just their activities but their money. The tricky and cunning language that the Greens use under the auspices of democracy, they always mean the opposite. But they know that to make their message easily consumable and perhaps attractive to the mainstream, they must couch it in very cunning language. The member for Melbourne said that universities should be more about than turning up for lectures, and should be a time for reflection and a time of engagement. That's fine. That's your opinion. Why should you impose your opinion about what the university experience should be on all other university students? Yeah. If they just want to turn up and go to lectures and then go off to the footy club that they're a member of in their own community, or go off and get a job, go off and engage in another social activity elsewhere, who are you to tell them what they should and shouldn't be doing as part of their university experience? We now have the social police, the political police, that to be a complete human being, if you're a university student, you must be engaged in these activities. You can do it, and you did it, and so did I. And so did my good friend, the member for Casey. That was our choice. Why should we impose the way we ran our lives and our time at university on everyone else? We on this side of the House believe that tertiary students are adults who are intelligent enough to decide how their money should be allocated. That's why we strongly oppose this bill. That's why the Howard government treated students with respect and as adults, gave them the choice about how they should allocate their hard-earned dollars. We see in this bill, as we have seen before, a backdoor way of funding political activities. We've got requirements in the bill for guidelines, and these guidelines do underpin the legislation. And they effectively force a university to provide for representation and advocacy of students' interests. In other words, they will be forced to ensure that there is a political voice on campus, and I bet your bottom dollar that political voice is going to be the political voice of the left. So in other words, universities will be forced to facilitate. This provision really extends compulsory unionism beyond to what it was before the 2005 legislation. It really extends the obligations to formalise student politics. We've seen provisions in this and in previous bills that purportedly are there to allay the concerns that money can't be spent on political parties and candidates, but that in no way should fool us into thinking money isn't going to be spent on political campaigns, because money can still be directed to oppose certain political parties and candidates, which it has in the past, and if I was a betting woman, I would bet will happen again in the future. It will go to fund issues campaigns, as we've seen, as has been outlined by previous speakers on this side of the House. Of course there's going to be political activity. That's why the member for Melbourne, self-confessed trot, who's now wearing his comfortable green cloak,
Order. I ask the honourable member to refer to the member for Melbourne as the member for Melbourne, and he's a member of the Green Party in the chamber. That's his recognition.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I was alluding to a recent profile piece that had reflected on former close political colleagues of the member of Melbourne who said that at university he was a well-known Trotskyist, and I think it's important to always reflect on the full political experience of members in this House and to understand truly where their passions lie, to see and appreciate their political progression and development, and I was doing nothing other than that. We have in front of us a bill that will not only force students to pay for political activities with which they will likelihood not agree with, but also to fund services that can be and have been provided by the private sector. We see food and beverage services, and I remember from my time at university, it was always a joke. You wouldn't go to the cafe if you could avoid it. We all know that centrally provided subsidised services don't provide the best sort of services for consumers, and students are consumers. There are other services that have been outlined that have been pointed to as having suffered under voluntary student unionism. Well, if a service isn't going to be used by students and it's not needed and it's a duplication, why do you believe that it should be funded? It shouldn't be funded. Student life and university life is not static, it's dynamic. The needs and concerns of students change from generation to generation. Using compulsorily acquired student funds just to entrench certain services is just an expensive way of maintaining certain jobs at university and certain structures, which isn't necessarily catering to the needs and demands of students. This legislation is also a concern because there is no monitoring or policing of the way in which funds are spent. We don't know whether there's compliance with the guidelines, but let's look at the political reality. In any case, can anyone honestly believe that a Labor minister the relevant Labor minister at the time would hold a Labor student union president to account if they hadn't spent the compulsorily acquired funds accordingly. I don't think that would be the case. They can't even hold their own ministers to account, and we just have to look at the New South Wales and state Labor parties in government to see the lack of accountability. But I shouldn't go too much into detail on that because I'll keep the House till tomorrow night dinner time, and I'll still only be halfway through. But the problem with a lack of reporting and a lack of accountability is only compounded by the fact that this is, in fact, a broken promise. This does disadvantage students who don't have ready access to funds, who do have to work hard to put themselves through university. Why should they? Why should they be forced to incur an additional financial burden just because some people have this ideological position that student unions are great and students should be involved in all these activities and isn't it a wonderful life they can have on campus? Some people don't want that, and you shouldn't force it down their throat. It's probably a promise, it's probably part of the deal-making that is all part and parcel of the Labor Party, and perhaps it was one of those things that was part of the secret deal that sealed the Labor-Greens alliance. Perhaps one day we will know. What we do know is that it is unfair, it is inequitable, and it is an insult to adult students to say to them, we know what is best for you, we know how best to spend your money, we deem these sporting clubs appropriate to be supported. And I remember, and it happened until very recently, until we had voluntary student unionism, where you had small groups of students who would form a club and would benefit significantly financially from compulsory student unionism. Now, they should be able to pursue skiing or football, but they should fund it. They shouldn't expect that other student who's working 20, 30, 40 hours a week to put themselves through university, who may not want to or may not have the time to engage in these activities to fund their social life. Let's face it, young people today are pretty mature, even in their early to mid-teens. I think they know how to run their own social life and their own activities. They don't need the formalised structure of compulsorily funded organisations to actually live their life and to have fun. Our belief in voluntary student unionism is about freedom. It is about the freedom to allow students to choose. We don't have the arrogant attitude of thinking that students should live their life on campus a particular way, that they should believe in certain things. We believe that there should be freedom of inquiry, freedom of movement, freedom of activities, that it's a wonderful time for university students. They have the privilege to engage in tertiary studies. They should have the privilege to pursue whatever other endeavours they choose, and they should do it with their own money. They should not be forced to, and they should not be corralled through compulsory student unionism into a particular sort of support for political activities, sporting activities, social activities, or any other commercial activities on campus. And if the government was serious about the education revolution, surely the first step is respect. Respect for tertiary students as young adults who can decide what they can do with their own money. And I would appeal to those on the other side to stop and think about that very basic fact. If students are smart enough to make their own decision about voting at a federal election, then they're smart enough to decide how they can spend their $250.
Order.